Mark Vargas, thank you for joining us on a snowy and blustery day in Chicago. And we are coming together to discuss just what happens now in Washington now that finally the impeachment process is at an end. And Mark, I want to introduce you. For those who don't know, you used to work in the Bush administration. You were an aide to Robert Gates, the defense secretary then, and you are still remain very well connected in Washington. And we know that you have your fingers on the pulse of what's happening, both in the news as well as, more importantly, perhaps what's behind the scenes in Washington. So thank you for joining us, and we'll dive into the impeachment process, or Washington, I should say, post-impeachment. Give us your overall assessment now that we've had a chance to look at the vote in the Senate yesterday and the president as he spoke this morning.
Well, Terry, thanks again for having me on the Illinois channel. It's always a privilege to be on here with you. But yeah, Washington, President Trump has declared, and rightly so, a victory with the acquittal in the Senate yesterday. And so he just spoke at the White House in the East Room not long ago. And I have to tell you, it was the most relaxed that I've ever seen the president. He was self-deprecating. He was honest. He was grateful, and he went through, as we were talking about earlier, a very long list of members of Congress that he wanted to personally thank, in addition to his legal team for all of their work. But this is a bad day for the Democrats. They've had a tough several years, but finally, after the Russia investigation, which didn't show anything, after this impeachment didn't show anything, the president is now able to focus and move forward with the agenda, and that's working for the American people.
In his comments today at the White House, one of the things that the president spent the majority of his time thanking people who had helped him, members of Congress as well as his legal team. But he also made some comments, and understandably so, I suppose, that he said, we went through hell, meaning his administration and his family. And he also said he thought Nancy Pelosi was a horrible person. That's a direct quote. He also said at one point that he questioned whether she even prays, referring to when she would say we have to be prayerful, and that she prays for the president. He questioned that, as well as I think what he would say was Mitt Romney's appeal to religion as a reason to vote against him, the only Republican senator to vote against him on one of the articles of impeachment. Let me say this, knowing Washington as you do, is it too poisoned to move forward, or will the Democrats in the House, in your estimation, finally say, this is an election year, we got to put some bills on the board so that we can run on something besides impeachment, besides hating President Trump? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point. And I've always liked to say the opposite of progress is Congress. And since the Democrats have been in control of the House, it's been investigate instead of legislate. And the American people sent members of Congress to Washington to legislate, to improve their lives, to address issues like prescription drug prices and healthcare reform and infrastructure and immigration and national security. They didn't send their members of Congress to Washington to waste millions and millions of dollars and time, quite frankly, to investigate the president. And so, Washington is partisan, and it's a bit poisonous, and it always has been historically. But the president has a knack and a gift for bringing people together, and he did that, for example, with the First Step Act, where we saw broad, historic, bipartisan support. And so, the Democrats are backed into a corner right now, particularly in the House, because they really haven't done anything except investigate. And so I think the president's got enormous leverage right now going into the election year to finally say, okay, Nancy Pelosi, it's time to work with me and get something done on behalf of the American people.
It was striking to me in January, here we're just recording this on February 6th, while the impeachment trial was going on in the Senate, the president held a press conference with Benjamin Netanyahu announcing his peace plan for the Middle East, He had a press conference in which he signed the trade deal with China. They had the signing of the bill of the U.S. MCA with the trade deal with Canada and Mexico. And to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone, to me it was the visuals were stunning that here the White House is moving forward on all these agenda items. And what's the Congress doing? They're engaged in this long, drawn-out impeachment process that we all knew was going to end up with the exoneration of the president because the Republicans controlled the Senate. There's just no way that the president was going to be thrown out of office. Give me your thoughts on that. And to what extent is the White House, to your knowledge, tuned into this as a strategy, and how will this play out for the rest of this year leading up to the November elections?
Well, the Democrats keep stumbling. Number one, they stumbled when they couldn't defeat Donald Trump in 2016. They stumbled when they tried to go after him with Russia collusion, and they've stumbled when they tried to go after him with Ukraine and impeachment. And then just a couple of days ago, talk about bad marketing. Here the Democrats are telling the American people, vote for us. We'd like to run the country, yet they couldn't even run their own caucus in Iowa. And as of right now, we still do not have a definitive winner, although I think they've got about 97, 98% reporting. But we're still days after the Iowa caucus, and we don't have a clear winner yet. And so I think it's indicative that the Republican Party is in trouble. And to your point earlier, it is remarkable how much President Trump has accomplished with such a partisan Congress. Remember, he passed the First Step Act in the middle of the Russian collusion investigation, and all of these USMCA, this historic Middle East peace plan, which, by the way, was rejected by the Palestinians before it was even proposed, trade deals with China. So the president remarkably has accomplished an incredible amount. So just imagine how much he can accomplish now that he's got Congress's attention and they're able to fully legislate without any other distractions.
So where do we go from here? What are you hearing anything? Do you know anything about the Trump legislative agenda going forward? Or just, is the president going to reach out and try to work with the Democrats? Do you think the Democrats will go, okay, we got to get back into the game of passing legislation and focusing on that? What's your sense of the lay of the land?
Well, the Democrats have no choice now to work with President Trump and the White House and his administration, because they haven't really been participating up until this point, since they've had the majority in the House. But I'd recommend, and the president's talking about infrastructure, find some things that are bipartisan that they can work on and pass. But the unfortunate part is now that we're coming up to the 2020 election, there's just a small window. Any president, this is sort of the time frame. That's why the first 100 days of any presidency is so important, because you really have that honeymoon period where you can really push your legislative priorities in the first 100 days of your presidency. But then year 2, you're focused on midterms. Year 3, you're adjusting to whatever the results were in the midterms, whether it's a new Congress, whether it's a new House or a new Senate. And in year 4, you're running for re-election or you're a lame duck. And so historically, this is a tough time right now to get anything done in Washington, because the focus is the 2020 election. However, this is a little bit more unique. And I think that the president has incredible leverage now to go back to Congress and say, let's look at infrastructure. Let's address prescription drug prices. Let's address healthcare. Let's find some things like we did in the First Step Act that we share some commonalities and knock up some wins before the election.
It's a couple of interesting points to make. One is, during the impeachment trial in the Senate, a Gallup poll came out and showed the president a 49% favorable rating, which is his highest ever. And that really says something. about how different this impeachment trial was. Many people contrasting it against the process that back in the Watergate days with Richard Nixon and when Bill Clinton were president, and they went through similar periods, that their ratings, of course, were going down, that there was a lot of concern in the country. And yet this one, I think, is widely viewed as being largely a sham, a show trial. The president's ratings go up. The American people were not watching by all the ratings, not really paying close attention, keeping an eye on it, but just, again, we knew how this was going to end. And so I just kind of wonder how this is going to carry forward, and whether the Democrats who brought this, some of the Republican managers against Bill Clinton, when they ran following Bill Clinton's acquittal, they lost election. And I just wonder if the voters will hold the Democrats who brought this to bear, will face retribution from the voters. And then secondly, just as you said, the president spoke today when he spoke at the White House just about, imagine the things that we could have gotten accomplished if we had put this much effort, not into an impeachment trial that was going to end up with an acquittal, as everyone accepted, but if we had passed an infrastructure bill that he wants to do, he wants to do any number of things on the health care front. There's always issues that the United States has to encounter. And the one last thing I would say is that as we speak here today, the markets are up again on all new high. Overnight, China just took tariffs off of $75 billion in American trade. Again, another victory for the Trump strategy of applying these tariffs on China that even members of the Republican Party thought were going to be a disaster. And yet that's what brought China to the fore to sign this first phase of a trade agreement with them. And so we see them now releasing tariffs on $75 billion. So again, I mentioned that people will go, well, you're just speaking on behalf of the president. I'm reporting the facts. These are the facts. He's at a 49% high. China just released their tariffs they had on our products, and the market's at an all-time high. That has to be, the wind is in the sails of the president, and I think the Democrats have to get their act together to say, what are we going to run on besides hating Donald Trump? They got to come up with something.
You bring up an excellent point. And last night, for this President's State of the Union address, I had some friends that were watching the President's State of the Union at the Democratic National Club. And I had some friends that were watching the State of the Union at Trump Hotel. And the comparison is night and day. Some of my friends actually left the Democratic National Club because, number one, there was no energy, and there weren't a lot of people there. Went down the street about less than a mile down the road to Trump Hotel, and there were probably easily 400 or 500 people there. The energy was high, the excitement was high, and I think that's a key indicator of where the Democratic Party is right now versus where the Republican Party is. And you're right, the president's poll numbers have gone up as a result of the impeachment. For example, Mitt Romney's numbers have been in decline in Utah, while at the same time, President Trump's approval ratings have gone up in Utah over the last several weeks. And so, again, the leverage is all on the Republican side. The momentum is all on the Republican side. President Trump has gone up in terms of support in the African-American community. He was elected at 8%. He's right now at 22%. In the Hispanic community, he was elected at 28%, and he's currently at 36%. And so I would anticipate all of those numbers continuing to rise. And at this point, I think if you're a Democrat, you're kind of scratching your head, and you're probably resigned to the fact that because the markets are so strong, because the economy is so strong, President Trump's going to get reelected.
I think it's Donald Trump's election to lose at this point. And the other thing I would say is the question is going to be, too, will the Republicans be able to take control of the House? You have Jerry Nadler, the Judiciary Committee chairman, talking about continuing to investigate the president, maybe trying to find something else he can impeach him on again.
It's outrageous.
I think Mr. Nadler needs to be told that train has left the station, and I think that would, if you want to really have a train wreck for the Democratic Party, then they should go ahead and try to impeach the president again. I don't think the American people would stand for it. I think the Democrats have to, in my estimation, probably work with the president on something like an infrastructure bill that would be good for the unions as well as just the nation. And then that way they can claim to have a bipartisan victory and actually have something that would be good. We do need a lot of infrastructure work done here around the nation. If there's anything else you wanted to say on, oh, by the way, one thing also I would bring to the attention is that just the other day, I don't have a clip of it, but James Carville, who is the architect of the Bill Clinton, the Raging Cajun, who coined the phrase "it's the economy, stupid," was being interviewed on it was either CNN or MSNBC.
MSNBC.
And said, was complaining, and he said the Democrats are not focusing on issues that matter to the American people. So I say that because I don't want people thinking we're just being partisan because we're saying things that are favorable to the president and not favorable to the Democratic Party. That's my assessment, but you tell us a bit, for those who don't know you, how you are plugged into Washington, and just why we're talking to you as someone who has their fingers on the pulse of what goes on in D.C., as well as Chicago and other places.
Sure. Well, I spent 12 years in Washington as a political insider. I worked under administrations of President George W. Bush and Obama when I was in the office of the Secretary of Defense, when Robert Gates was head of the Pentagon. And so, I've spent a lot of time in DC. I'm also a contributor for the Washington Examiner as part of their Beltway Confidential blog, and I have a lot of contacts that are in the media there, White House reporters, and so there's a lot of intel going back and forth. But yeah, you brought up an excellent point, and the Raging Cajun is just one example. When he was on MSNBC, on that same station, Chris Matthews was really frustrated, particularly with the Iowa caucuses. And Chris Matthews said the Democrats right now couldn't even arrange a three-car funeral. And Van Jones was on CNN saying nobody can beat Trump. Ari Melber on MSNBC, who's got his own show, he's frustrated with the Democratic Party. And so whether you're on CNN or MSNBC, there's no disputing the fact that Democratic operatives right now, they're frustrated. And this debacle in Iowa is only making the case that Donald Trump is unbeatable.
Yeah, again, going back to all those things I mentioned earlier in the White House, where he's meeting with Netanyahu, he's meeting with the Chinese, he's signing into law the trade agreement with Canada and China, and Canada and Mexico, I should say, as well as we forget, he also had a trade agreement put together with the Japanese, a new trade agreement. And then it's just for the Democrats, they look like the gang that can't shoot straight. Even today, as we tape this, Tom Perez, the DNC chairman, came out and is saying that Iowa ought to do a redo. Go back and recaucus and let's just start over. This is ridiculous that you people can't get your votes counted approaching a week after the event. So the optics are certainly not good. And so the Democrats do have their work cut out for them. They need to change the image of them. And let me also then switch. The other thing that, Mark, I'll tell the audience that you are also a spokesperson for the Blagojevich family. And, one of the impacts of this whole impeachment thing, I equate it to a car breaking down in the middle of an intersection where all the other traffic of Washington, all the other legislation and things that should be considered are just backed up. And one of those that you've been working on is an effort to try to get former Governor Rod Blagojevich a pardon so he could get out early. I believe he's been in, you can tell us, he's got a 14-year
Almost
sentence.
8 years.
Almost 8 years. So tell us a bit about that and what's happening on that score.
Yeah, we are incredibly grateful to the president for keeping Rod and and Patty and our case on his radar. We remain in direct communication with the White House. Again, we're very, very hopeful. And the president has been consistent going all the way back to 2012 that Rod Blagojevich's prison sentence was outrageous, 14 years as a nonviolent first-time offender. And so we've got unique, broad, bipartisan support. And I was talking with Patty about this the other day. Rod's sentence of 14 years, they were Illinois politicians and the federal prosecutor were hoping that this would somehow deter elected officials from engaging in actual actual corruption. But it's interesting. I think it's probably done the opposite. And now we see case after case, indictment after indictment of Illinois politicians who have been taking bribes. And it's important to point out that Rod Blagojevich didn't take one penny, and he's serving a 14-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, you've got Sandoval, who took $250,000 in bribes. And so I think it's real unfortunate. If Governor Pritzker is making criminal justice reform a priority of his administration, if he's wanting to address unjust sentences, then I challenge him to come out and support the release of Rod Blagojevich from prison, because 14 years for a non-violent offender is just too long. And Rod Blagojevich does not pose a threat to society. We should reserve prison space for those that we're afraid of, not those that we're mad at.
And to be clear, Governor Pritzker would not have to support a pardon. I mean, just as far as the mechanics of this, he doesn't have to support a pardon. The president could just come out and give him a pardon. Is that correct?
Yeah, the president can act. It's his prerogative as the president. But I think we're going to be consistent here. We've already, Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois has already come out talking about how outrageous his sentence is. Reverend Jesse Jackson has come out asking for a pardon. Even former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder has come out talking about that his sentence just didn't make sense. And of all people, former Governor George Ryan has said in a local Chicago interview that he's certainly no fan of Rod Blagojevich, but that 14-year sentence, he got a raw deal, and he supports him coming home.
As we close out, Mark, does this investigation that is now going on in Illinois, where we see former Senator Sandoval pleading guilty, we have other people who are in the legislature indicted, an ongoing investigation by the FBI, does that have any impact in your estimation into whether or not the climate is right for Rod Blagojevich to be released, or is it immaterial?
No, I think it helps our case, because these folks actually took money. They took bribes. And Rod never took one dime. And the most sensational charge of selling of the Senate seat, reporters like to write about he was trying to sell the Senate seat. But what no one likes to follow up with those pieces is that on appeal, all of those convictions as related to the sale of the Senate seat were overturned and were labeled routine political log rolling. And so, again, I think the corruption, broad and mass corruption that is now being exposed here in Illinois, again, only helps our case.
Well, Mark Vargas, we'll have to see. Do you have any idea in your conversations with those in the White House, do you have any idea as to whether that is, I'm sure a lot of things have been on the back burner and they're going to bring some things to the front burner. Are you getting any feedback that might get some renewed consideration from the White House?
Oh, this has always been on the radar behind the scenes. And, the president certainly has had a lot on his plate. But I think he's going to be emboldened now. He's been vindicated. These investigations are over. And so we are hopeful that in the right timing, the president will send Rod home.
Mark Vargas, should that happen, certainly we'll want to talk to you again. And as always, we appreciate you joining us. Good luck to you on what is a rather dismal day weather-wise in Chicago, but we'll look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
Thanks so much, Terry. Have a good one.